Relational databases. Let's talk about what a relational database is and look at some examples to help us understand this concept. Here I am in MySQL. MySQL has this great tool that shows you a diagram or a drawing that represents what your database is. There's another view in MySQL that we typically use, which actually shows us the data, but this view kind of gives us an overall picture of what's going on. So in my database that I set up, I have two, let's use the word objects for now. One represents a student and one represents an advisor. And these are typically called entities. That's another word that you could use. I have a relationship between these two entities. It's shown by this little arrow here with a multi-prong on the left side. This means one advisor can have multiple students. Now, just to kind of explain that in even more detail, we're ultimately going to look at the data in this table, and we're going to have rows of data, and it is going to list a lot of different student IDs, and it's going to list their names, and it's going to give us an advisor ID. So I might have advisor ID 1, and in this other table, I have a list of my advisors. I have an advisor ID, for example, advisor ID 1, and the advisor's name. Now, if you think about it, this is kind of clever in a way, because suppose I had many students that had advisor ID 1, whoever that is, and suppose the advisor changed their name. Well, I would have a little bit of an issue if I referred to the advisor's name directly in this table, wouldn't I? I'd have to go into this table, and everywhere where I had the advisor's name, I would have to change it. But instead, if I use an ID, that ID points to one row in this table, and then I just have to update that one row and change the advisor's name. And that actually, in a nutshell, is the simplest way to explain how you should be setting up a database. You don't want to have a lot of repeated information, because if you have repeated information, you're going to get into trouble. It's difficult to maintain. There can be inconsistencies. If I had not had an advisor ID and I had their advisor name in there and their name changes, I have to update a lot of rows. I don't want to do that. Let's switch now and look at the actual data and kind of go down even a little bit deeper. So I'm switching to my database where I actually have these tables, and they're right here. I have the advisor table and the student table. So let's start at the advisor table, and we can click on this little icon here, and we can see what we have in the table. We currently don't have anything, so I'm going to add some information in. I'll add advisor ID 1, and I'll say the advisor name is Joan Smith, and I'll make another one. I don't have to really make them be sequential. I'll just skip around a little bit, and I'll make this be Joe Brown. So I have these two advisors. In an actual database, I probably would not have their name, first name and last name together like that. Maybe I'd have two fields. Maybe I had advisor first name, advisor second name. I'm kind of just showing you a really simple example. All right, now let's go over to the student. I don't have any student information currently, so let's just edit that. I'll have student ID 1. I'll give them the name of Sally Marshall. And I have to give a student advisor ID. And I have 1 and 5 is what I created for advisor IDs. I'll give this person 1. And let's just add a couple more. Let's have this also have 1. And we'll do another one. We'll give her 5. Oops, 5. Now, I now have two tables loaded up, and through these two tables, I can then write statements in SQL that let me ask the database for information about these two tables. I can do really simple things. I can say, well, I want you to select all the information out of this table called student for me. And that's actually what this SQL command is showing you up above, and it's showing you the results in kind of a pretty table down below. But I could say other things. I could say, well, I only want to see the student's name. Or I can say really trickier things that takes two tables and combine them. So for example, I could say, well, I want all the information out of this table, student ID, but you know this advisor ID, I'd like to take that advisor ID and look in my other column for my other table for advisors. And when you match up that ID, pull out that advisor name. So I get a really nice report that shows me the student's name and the advisor name. So that's what SQL can do. It can take multiple tables and combine them and express the relationship through these tables and reports that really provide the information that you need. So that's kind of where we're heading when we work with SQL. Let's talk just a little bit more about the table so we can get some of these basic concepts in place. So I'll switch back to the student table. So when we have a table, one important aspect of a table is the way that you're going to primarily find rows in the table. So in other words, when I go to search, when I tell SQL to search for records in my student table, am I mostly searching for records by student ID, or am I mostly searching for records by student name? And you can tell MySQL what you plan to use to search when you set up the table. And this is really called the index. And I'm going to click right here. I'm going to see the index. And the index that we have is student ID. And that makes sense. That's usually what's used in tables. You'll have an ID column, and you're telling the database to kind of fine-tune itself, because when you go to ask for information on this table, you'll be doing it by this ID. So, hey, MySQL, do whatever you have to do under the covers to make it really efficient when I tell you to find an ID. And let's look at another little, not little, it's kind of a really important point. Let's talk about how we have this table with students and we have this table advisor, and we know that when we fill out this student table for a student and we do the advisor ID, well, you know, when I put in 5, it sure would be nice to have the database tell me if advisor ID 5 doesn't exist, right? Because if 5 doesn't exist over in the advisor table, I have a problem. And you can do that by creating something called a foreign key. So in this foreign key, I can create a rule that basically says that this advisor ID must exist in this table here, that there must be a match between the two. Actually, let's see if we can see what happens if we make a mistake in our in entering data. So let's say we have a new person. Let's say it's Carlos Ito, and let's say he has advisor ID 7. Now that doesn't exist. So if we try to apply this, we'll just see what it does. It says there's an error and it can't actually do it, and it's kind of, you know, buried in the details here, but it's basically pointing out that we cannot do the insertion of 7 because there is no such advisor. So that was just a real quick introduction to what relationship or what databases are about. And in this module, we're going to be exploring SQL and doing some SQL commands. And so hopefully this will give you a basis for it. And have at it trying out different SQL commands you have to do to complete the assignment in this module.